Marie and Antoine were lovers in a little Breton town. Marie worked hard for a pittance in the farms and the fields around, and Antoine was a sailor who was often far away, but he'd given her his word that he'd marry her one day. They met up as and when they could with a passion young and wild, and so it happened, as it so often does, that Marie was carrying his child. She ran to ask what they should do. He said, "You leave it to me. You know I'll always be there for you." And he promptly ran off to sea. He was away for many months, and word of him came none. And nature did what nature does, and Marie gave birth to a son. The villagers were scandalized. They called her names and more. Her family disowned her. She was turned away from Antoine's mother's door. And where's Antoine while this is going on? Drinking in the ship's mess. Thinking of home hardly ever at all. Thinking of Marie even less. She couldn't get bread, she couldn't get work. She wasn't even left with her pride. And the baby was never a strong boy. And one day, young Antoine died. The villagers said, "It's God's judgment. She's only herself to blame. She couldn't put up with the loneliness, the poverty, the pain." There was an old rope hanging in a barn. She was never seen again. Word reached Antoine, who sighed with relief and decided no more to roam. He'd earned a fair packet while away at sea, and now it was time to come home. He reached the village late one night, found the cottage and went inside. He was all alone in the family home, for his mother had also died. And he was sitting there counting his money, rejoicing he was no longer poor, when he heard footsteps in the yard, heard the creaking of the door. "Who's there?" he said, and suddenly stopped. His hair stood up, his eyes were wild, for there, in the doorway in front of him, stood Marie and her poor, starving child. Empty white eyes stared back at him. He was gripped to his chair by fear. "Antoine," she said, look after us, my dear. We're cold, we're poor, we're starving. Antoine, why weren't you here?" Some people say they heard a scream, but that they couldn't be sure. And when they found him next day, his hair had turned white, and he lay dead upon the floor, with his fortune scattered around him, of which he would not spend 1 centime more. And even now, 1,000 years on, down by the stormy seas, a gentle voice is sometimes heard, carried on the breeze. "Antoine," it says, look after us, my dear. We're cold, we're poor, we're starving. Antoine, why weren't you here?"